Graceland is usually presented as a symbol of fame, but in reality, it's an example of how private real estate can be more stable than any legend. If you remove the name Elvis Presley and look at Graceland purely as a property, a very different picture emerges. It's a large, isolated residential house, designed so that most everyday needs could be met within a single, self-contained territory. That structure is what explains how the house actually functioned. When the property was purchased in 1957, it wasn't seen as a palace or an architectural landmark. It was a private residence on the outskirts of Memphis, set on a large plot of land and clearly separated from the surrounding city. In terms of layout and location, Graceland existed apart from the urban environment, rather than being integrated into a dense residential neighborhood. The house wasn't positioned at a central crossroads, nor did it directly border neighboring properties. A separate access road, distance from street traffic, and the sheer size of the land created a sense of spatial isolation. Inside, the volume of the house allowed for many rooms to exist without all of them being used at the same time. Entire sections could remain inactive for long periods without affecting the overall rhythm of daily life. At the time of purchase, Graceland had no public function at all. It wasn't designed for receptions, events, or displays of status. The architecture and layout didn't operate as a symbol. This was private real estate, built for living, not for being seen. What's important is that the exterior of the house changed very little over time. There were no formal gardens, no symmetrical driveways, no landscape features meant to exaggerate scale or importance. Graceland remained within its original footprint and never used architecture as a way to project significance. The real transformations happened inside. The clearest example is the basement level. In a typical house, a basement serves a secondary or technical role. Here, it was fully integrated into the living structure and given independent functions. The basement included a room with multiple televisions arranged for simultaneous viewing. This was a dedicated functional space, completely separate from the home's more formal areas. Nearby was a billiards room, where most of the floor space was taken up by the table and supporting furniture, a clear sign of regular use rather than decoration. There was also a fully enclosed racquetball court. For a private residence, this was highly unusual. Spaces like this are normally built as separate structures. At Graceland, the sports facility was integrated directly into the basement and had its own access logic, independent from the main living zones. After these basement spaces, clearly functional and technically embedded into the house, Graceland introduces a room that breaks from this logic entirely. This is the jungle room. Unlike the other rooms, the jungle room was not part of the original plan. It's the one area where the architecture stops being restrained. Spatially, the jungle room doesn't extend the house, it contrasts with it. Everything changes here: materials, textures, acoustics, and visual density. Stone, heavy wood, dense finishes, and a built-in waterfall create an environment that barely interacts with the outside world. Windows play almost no role, and natural light isn't a key part of how the space is experienced. Unlike the living room or the dining area, the jungle room was not a transitional space. No circulation routes passed through it. It functioned as an isolated room of presence, with its own use pattern, disconnected from the rest of the house. Another aspect of Graceland that's rarely noticed is how staff operated within the house, and how little they were visible in its everyday structure. There was no classical estate model with rigidly separated formal and service worlds. At the same time, staff movement was not chaotic or intrusive. Despite the size of the property and the status of its owner, many things typically associated with famous large residences simply didn't happen at Graceland. And those absences explain a great deal about how the house was meant to function. There were no large public receptions. The house wasn't used for mass events, formal banquets, or regular gatherings. The layout was never designed to hold large numbers of people in a single space, and those scenarios were never built into the structure. There was no grand hall or central room that automatically became the focal point. No single space functioned as a main stage. This removed the possibility of the house operating as a display environment. Graceland wasn't an open house, even in everyday terms. There was no free movement across all zones. Access to different parts of the house was always selective, and nothing in the architecture forced the entire space to be open at once. There was no permanent guest mode. The house wasn't reorganized around visitors, didn't shift its rhythm, and didn't adapt its layout for outsiders. Even when people were present, the house didn't become a public space. There were also no regular interior overhauls. The house wasn't updated on cycles, redesigned to follow trends, or visually modernized. The space remained stable, without layers of changing styles or eras. There was no single schedule dictating how and when all rooms should be used. Different zones could be active or inactive independently of one another. This eliminated centralized control of the space. And finally, Graceland was never fully open. Even at moments of peak activity, the house remained structurally closed, not because it was locked down, but because it was never designed to be open in the first place. These very qualities, the absence of formality, a single central space, a permanent guest mode, and demonstrative architecture, are what made Graceland resilient to a change in role. When the house stopped being a private residence, it didn't need to change its internal logic. The transition to public status didn't happen through renovation, but through a rethinking of access. The house was never fully opened, it was opened selectively. Because of that, Graceland was preserved not as a set piece, but as a coherent structure capable of functioning in a new role without losing its original organization. After the death of Elvis Presley in 1977, Graceland remained private property, but maintaining a house and grounds of that scale required constant expense. The next step, therefore, wasn't romantic, it was operational. The house was prepared for a format that could receive visitors while maintaining control over space. The key decision wasn't to redesign the interiors, but to control movement. Instead of opening the house, a limited circulation route was created, guiding visitors sequentially through specific areas, without access to every room and without free movement. In this way, the house retained its structure, and the museum format worked through access rather than reconstruction. Graceland officially opened to the public as a museum in 1982, and what matters is that this transition didn't require turning the house into something else. It required making access controlled. That's why Graceland endured. It didn't become a new building for tourists. It remained the same house, operating under a different mode of entry and movement. Graceland survived not because it became a museum, but because it was never designed to be a public house in the first place.